I felt my legs give out first. One moment I was reaching for the bathroom counter. The next, my body crumpled to the cold tile floor like a puppet with cut strings. My muscles refused to obey. My fingers clawed uselessly at the cabinet, desperate to pull myself up. That's when I heard her voice behind me. Stop faking illness to win Grandpa's sympathy. My sister Amanda stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me struggle to breathe on the floor. She didn't call for help. She didn't kneel down. She just watched with a small smile I'll never forget. I didn't know yet that she had poured my muscle relaxant pills into the toilet and filled the bottle with water. I didn't know our mother had told her to do it, and I certainly didn't know that in 2 weeks that our grandfather's will-reading police would walk through the door and several members of my own family would be taken away in handcuffs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Christina Hartwell. I'm 35 years old, a senior financial analyst at a respected firm in Boston, though my family has never bothered to learn what that actually means. To them, I've always been the invisible daughter, the one who faded into the background while my younger sister Amanda sparkled in the spotlight. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, my life was quiet, routine. I lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by books and the soft hum of my medical equipment. Most people wouldn't guess that I earned more than anyone else in my family. They certainly wouldn't guess that my job involved auditing financial records, tracing money through shell companies, and uncovering fraud. My family thought I pushed papers at some generic office. They never asked. I stopped offering. My daily reality was shaped by something they refused to believe existed: a chronic autoimmune neuromuscular disorder. Dr. Margaret Sullivan. My neurologist had explained it to me years ago in terms I'll never forget. The severe pneumonia I suffered at 14 had damaged my nervous system permanently. Without my daily medication, my muscles would begin to fail within 48 hours. First the tremors, then the weakness, then paralysis. The pills weren't optional. They were the only thing standing between me and a body that would stop obeying my commands. I had learned to be careful. Living alone with a condition like mine meant preparing for the worst. A few months earlier, I'd installed a small security camera in my living room. Nothing fancy, just a little device that recorded to the cloud. I told myself it was for safety. But some part of me, some quiet instinct I couldn't name, whispered that I might need proof of something someday. The only person in my family who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Harold Hartwell. He was 78, a retired federal judge with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He visited me that week with a container of homemade soup and a weight on his shoulders. I could see the moment he walked through my door. We sat at my small kitchen table, and he spoke carefully, like a man choosing each word with precision. I've had someone looking into the foundation and its finances for almost 2 years now, he said quietly. The money trail leads to your Uncle Mark, but there's a secondary account we can't identify yet. Someone else is involved, hiding behind shell companies. I don't know who. He looked at me, then really looked at me, the way no one else in my family ever did. That's why I need someone with real financial expertise to take over the foundation. Someone I can trust completely. I understood what he wasn't saying. He was asking me, and he was warning me. Before he left, he squeezed my hand and said something I didn't fully understand until later. If anything happens to me, everything is prepared. My lawyer has instructions. I didn't know then that across town my mother was having a very different conversation with my sister. Your grandfather is giving the foundation to Christina, Diane whispered urgently to Amanda behind closed doors. She's a financial analyst. She'll audit everything. We cannot let that happen. Amanda asked why it mattered so much. My mother's answer was sharp. Just do what I tell you. Prove she's faking her illness. Make your grandfather doubt her. What my mother never mentioned, what she had spent 21 years burying, was that my illness existed because of Amanda, because I had jumped into a pool to save her life when I was 14 and she was 11, because I held her above water until someone finally noticed, because I nearly drowned doing it and the pneumonia that followed destroyed my nervous system forever. My mother's response when I woke up in the hospital after 3 weeks fighting for my life. Don't play hero next time. Amanda knows how to swim. You just wanted attention. That night, while I slept peacefully in my apartment, someone was already standing outside my door, holding a spare key and a plan that had been months in the making. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was at work the next day, my sister was inside my apartment. Amanda used the spare key my mother had kept for years, the one she claimed was only for emergencies. She walked through my living room, past my small kitchen, and straight into my bathroom where I kept my medication on the counter. She opened the bottle, poured every single pill into the toilet, and flushed. Then she filled the empty bottle with tap water from an unwashed cup sitting by the sink. She didn't know about the security camera in my living room. She didn't know it recorded her entering, with that key, disappearing into the bathroom, and emerging minutes later with a satisfied smirk on her face. She texted our mother before she left. The message was simple: done. Now we wait. My mother replied, good. Delete this conversation. Amanda deleted the messages. But phone records, as I would later learn, can always be recovered. 36 hours after I took what I thought was my medication, my hands started trembling during a presentation at work. I was standing in front of 6 colleagues pointing at a chart on the screen when my fingers began to shake so badly I couldn't hold the laser pointer. I laughed it off, blamed it on too much coffee, and pushed through the rest of the meeting. I told myself it was stress. I told myself I just needed sleep. I was wrong. 48 hours after the tampering, I collapsed in my bathroom. I had just stepped out of the shower when my legs simply stopped working. One moment I was reaching for my towel. The next I was on the cold tile floor, my body crumpled against the cabinet. I tried to stand. My legs refused. I tried to push myself up with my arms. They barely responded. The tremors had spread through my entire body. My muscles were shutting down one by one, exactly the way Dr. Sullivan had warned me they would if I ever stopped taking my medication. But I hadn't stopped. I had taken my pills every single day. I didn't understand what was happening. I dragged myself across the bathroom floor inch by inch until I reached my phone on the bedroom carpet. My fingers were shaking so violently I could barely unlock the screen. I called my mother first. No answer. I called Amanda. No answer. I lay there on the floor alone, struggling to breathe, and finally called 911. The paramedics found me barely conscious. They rushed me to Massachusetts General, where doctors ran test after test, trying to understand why my body was failing. I spent 3 days drifting in and out of awareness, connected to machines, receiving emergency treatment to stabilize my nervous system. On the second day, Amanda came to visit. She walked into my room with flowers and a concerned expression, playing the role of the devoted sister in front of the nurses. But the moment we were alone, she leaned close to my bed and whispered words I will never forget. Mom was right. You've always faked being weak for attention. But this time, no one is going to believe you, not even Grandpa. I was too weak to respond. I could only stare at her, my heart breaking at the hatred in her eyes. This was my sister, the girl I had saved from drowning 21 years ago, the girl I had nearly died for, and she was standing over my hospital bed mocking my suffering while I could barely lift my head. On the third day, Grandfather Harold arrived. I heard his voice in the hallway before I saw him commanding and sharp, despite his 78 years. He ordered everyone out of the room. My mother protested, insisting she had a right to stay, but Harold's voice cut through her objections like a blade. Out, now, all of you. When the door closed and we were alone with Amanda, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Harold didn't sit. He stood at the foot of my bed, his eyes fixed on my sister with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, controlled, furious. I know what you did, he said quietly. I've had people watching this family for 2 years. I know about the medication. Amanda's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. She's faking everything, just like she always... Don't. Harold's voice was ice. I also know you're not acting alone. Someone put you up to this. Someone who has a lot more to lose than you do. I watched Amanda's expression flicker with confusion. She didn't understand what he meant. She had no idea about the financial investigation, about the missing money, about the conspiracy our mother had been hiding. She thought this was just about proving I was a liar. She had no clue she was a pawn in a much larger game. Harold continued, his voice heavy with disappointment. I'm giving you 24 hours to tell Christina the truth. Confess what you did. It's your only chance to show you have any integrity left. Amanda's chin lifted defiantly. You're old and confused. No one will believe you. Harold stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, the sadness in his eyes deeper than any anger. He turned to me, walked to my bedside, and leaned down to kiss my forehead. His hand was warm and steady on my cheek. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he whispered. "I've prepared everything. No matter what happens to me, the truth will come out." I didn't understand the weight of those words until it was too late. I was discharged 5 days later. My body was slowly recovering with new medication, but I was still weak, still shaken, still trying to process what had happened. I returned to my quiet apartment and tried to rebuild some sense of normal life. 1 week after my discharge, I received a phone call that shattered everything. Grandfather Harold had died of a sudden heart attack. I sat on my couch for hours, unable to move, unable to cry. The only person in my family who had ever truly believed me was gone. The only person who had ever fought for me. I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. At the funeral, I watched my mother and Amanda from across the room. They wore black. They dabbed their eyes with tissues. But something was wrong with their grief. It was too composed, too controlled. They didn't look devastated. They looked relieved. Uncle Mark stood near the back, sweating, despite the cool autumn air, checking his phone every few minutes with the nervous energy of a man waiting for bad news. After the service, a man I didn't recognize approached me quietly. He introduced himself as Jonathan Webb, my grandfather's attorney. "Your grandfather left specific instructions," he said in a low voice. "There are 3 sealed envelopes, one for you personally, one to be delivered to the police, and one to be read publicly at the will reading." He paused, studying my face. "He prepared everything in his final weeks. He wanted you to know that." I nodded, too numb to fully process what he was telling me. But I didn't know yet that my grandfather had spent his last days building something far more powerful than a will. He had built a case, and I was about to become its executor. 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I finally felt strong enough to return to something resembling normal life. My body was still recovering, still rebuilding strength, but my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. I had spent those 14 days grieving, resting, and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. And somewhere in that fog of sadness and confusion, I remembered something important: the security camera. I had installed it months ago and set it to record continuously to the cloud. I checked the footage once a month as a routine precaution. I had been too weak, too devastated to think about it until now. I sat down at my laptop that morning with a cup of tea, expecting to find nothing but empty rooms and ordinary days. Instead, I found the truth. The recording from the day before my collapse showed my sister Amanda walking through my front door with a key I never gave her. I watched her cross my living room, disappear into my bathroom, and emerge several minutes later. The timestamp showed she had been in there long enough to do exactly what I now suspected. When she walked back through the living room toward the door, she was smirking. That small, satisfied smile told me everything I needed to know. I sat frozen in front of my screen, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My own sister. She had done this to me deliberately. She had tried to destroy my body, maybe even kill me, and she had smiled about it. I could have crumbled. I could have cried and waited for someone else to fix this. But something shifted inside me in that moment. I was done being the invisible daughter. I was done waiting for justice to find me. If I wanted the truth to come out, I would have to drag it into the light myself. I downloaded the footage immediately. Then I called the Boston Police Department and filed a formal criminal complaint. I emailed them the video file along with a detailed written statement describing what had happened to me. Next, I contacted Dr. Sullivan and requested a comprehensive medical report documenting exactly what happens to someone with my condition when their medication is suddenly removed. She provided everything I needed, including a statement that abrupt withdrawal could cause permanent paralysis or death. Finally, I hired my own attorney. Her name was Rebecca Torres, and she came highly recommended for cases involving family disputes and criminal matters. I wanted someone independent, someone who answered only to me. I was done trusting anyone else to protect my interests. The day before the will reading, I met with Jonathan Webb, my grandfather's lawyer. He explained what Harold had left behind: 3 sealed envelopes with specific instructions. One for me personally, one to be delivered to the police upon his death, and one to be read aloud at the will reading. When I told him about the security footage I had sent to the police, his expression changed. He looked at me with something like respect. Your grandfather's envelope to the police contains his investigators' findings about financial irregularities in the foundation, Webb said carefully. But Christina, his information was preliminary. He had suspicions, evidence of patterns, but nothing definitive. Your video changes everything. Your evidence is proof of an actual crime. It makes the whole case actionable. I understood then what my grandfather had done. He had given me the foundation because he trusted me. But he had also known that I would have to fight for my own justice. He had prepared the groundwork. I had to finish the battle. The will reading took place in Jonathan Webb's law office the following afternoon. The room was large and formal, with a long wooden table and leather chairs. I arrived early and took a seat near the window. My mother Diane came in next, followed by Amanda. Neither of them looked at me. Uncle Mark arrived last, sweating visibly despite the cool temperature of the room. His leg bounced nervously under the table and he kept checking his phone every few minutes. My father Richard was there too, sitting quietly in the corner, passive as always, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. I noticed something strange as the reading began. My mother kept shooting glances at Uncle Mark, quick warning looks that seemed to carry some unspoken message. Mark would nod slightly each time, then look away. I filed this detail away without understanding it. Not yet. Jonathan Webb began reading the will. The room fell silent. My grandfather's words, written in his own hand, echoed through the space like a voice from beyond the grave. Christina Hartwell is appointed sole trustee of the Harold Hartwell Foundation, valued at $4.2 million in assets. Amanda and Diane Hartwell shall each receive $10,000 sufficient to begin anew should they choose to change their path. Mark Hartwell shall receive nothing for reasons that will become clear in due time. And then a final note from my grandfather himself. I have loved my family despite their flaws, but I will not allow my legacy to reward those who have betrayed it. Amanda leaped to her feet before Webb had even finished speaking. Her face was red with fury. "This is insane," she shouted. "She's been faking her illness for years to manipulate Grandpa. This will is fraudulent." My mother stood beside her, her voice sharp and cold. "I'll have this will contested. Harold was clearly not of sound mind when he wrote this." Jonathan Webb remained perfectly calm. He folded his hands on the table and spoke quietly. "I would advise both of you to sit down. The Boston police are waiting in the lobby. They have questions for several people in this room." The door opened before anyone could respond. A man in a gray suit walked in, followed by two uniformed officers. He introduced himself as Detective Richard Mallory. His voice was professional, measured, and completely unimpressed by the drama unfolding before him. 3 days ago," he said, "we received video evidence and a formal complaint from Ms. Christina Hartwell regarding an incident of medication tampering. We also received a sealed document from Mr. Harold Hartwell's estate delivered per his instructions upon his death. Based on this combined information, we obtained a warrant this morning." I stood up. My voice was steady, stronger than I expected. "I sent that video to the police myself. I also provided Dr. Sullivan's medical report documenting that tampering with my medication could have caused permanent paralysis or killed me." Webb connected a laptop to a screen on the wall. The video played for everyone to see. Amanda entering my apartment with a key, walking to the bathroom, the sound of something being poured. Amanda emerging with that small, terrible smile, then leaving. The room was absolutely silent. Amanda's face had gone pale. Her hands were shaking. But my mother's reaction was different. She wasn't watching the video at all. She was scanning the room, her eyes darting from Mark to the detective to the envelope still sitting on Webb's desk. She looked terrified, but she didn't look surprised. Detective Mallory noticed it too. He made a small note in his book, and I realized something that sent ice through my veins. My mother wasn't shocked by what Amanda had done. She was scared of something else entirely, something bigger. The detective wasn't finished. He held up a document and said, "We also executed a warrant for Ms. Amanda Hartwell's phone records this morning. Our digital forensics team recovered the deleted messages. All of them." The room seemed to stop breathing. Detective Mallory held the document in his hand like a weapon, his eyes moving slowly across the faces in front of him. He addressed Amanda directly. "When you were brought in for initial questioning last week, you voluntarily surrendered your phone. You told us you had nothing to hide. Our forensic team recovered the deleted text conversation with your mother." Amanda's face went white. My mother's hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned pale. The detective began reading aloud, his voice flat and professional, letting the words speak for themselves. Diane Hartwell to Amanda Hartwell. Do whatever it takes. She cannot get control of that foundation. You understand me? Whatever it takes. He paused, then continued. Amanda Hartwell to Diane Hartwell. I switched her medication. Now we wait. Another pause. Diane Hartwell to Amanda Hartwell. Good. Delete this entire conversation. The detective looked up briefly before reading the final exchange. Amanda Hartwell to Diane Hartwell. Why is this so important to you? It's just money. Diane Hartwell to Amanda Hartwell, because if she audits those accounts, we're all finished. All of us. Just trust me and do what I say. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. I watched Amanda turn slowly toward our mother, her face twisted with confusion and the first stirrings of horror. We're all finished. Amanda's voice was barely a whisper. What does that mean? What did you do? My mother said nothing. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. Detective Mallory turned to Uncle Mark, who had been trying to edge toward the door without anyone noticing. An officer moved to block his path. Mr. Hartwell, the detective said calmly, your brother's private investigator documented that over the past 5 years, approximately $380,000 was transferred from the foundation into personal accounts. The primary trail led directly to you. Mark's face drained of all color. He started to stammer something about lawyers and rights, but the detective wasn't finished. However, he continued, our forensic accountants working with the FBI, since this case now involves interstate wire fraud, traced a secondary account. It was registered in Delaware under a maiden name. He turned to look directly at my mother. Your maiden name, Mrs. Hartwell. I felt the floor shift beneath me. My mother. Not just an instigator, not just someone who had encouraged Amanda to hurt me. She was a thief. She had been stealing from my grandfather's foundation for 5 years, working alongside Uncle Mark, hiding the money in accounts under her maiden name. And when my grandfather decided to give me control of the foundation, she knew I would find everything. I was a financial analyst. I would have audited those accounts within weeks. I would have discovered every stolen dollar traced, every transaction exposed, every lie. That was why she had told Amanda to destroy me. Not because she hated me, not because she believed I was faking my illness, because I was the only person in the family capable of uncovering her crime. She needed me gone before I could find the truth. Detective Mallory's voice cut through my thoughts. Mrs. Hartwell, you and your brother-in-law have been embezzling from the foundation together for 5 years. You didn't just encourage your daughter to harm your other daughter. You used her as a weapon to protect yourself from federal prosecution. My mother's composure finally shattered. I can explain. She started, her voice rising with desperation. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I was trying to protect the family. The money was just... Amanda's voice cut through the air like breaking glass. You used me. My mother turned to her, reaching out a hand. Honey, listen to me. You used me. Amanda's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. This whole time you used me. You made me think Christina was the problem. You made me hate her. You told me she was a liar, a manipulator, someone who was stealing Grandpa's love with fake symptoms and fake weakness. And it was all to save yourself. My mother tried to grab Amanda's arm. I was trying to protect our family. You have to understand. Amanda yanked her arm away violently. Don't touch me. The room had descended into chaos. Mark was demanding a lawyer at the top of his lungs. My mother was trying to explain herself to anyone who would listen. My father sat frozen in his chair, staring at his wife like he had never seen her before. Amanda stood alone in the middle of the room, tears running down her cheeks, her whole world crumbling around her. I stood up slowly. Something in my movement must have commanded attention because the room gradually fell silent as I walked forward. I stopped in front of my mother first. When I spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to rage. The truth was loud enough on its own. When I was 14 years old, I said quietly, I jumped into a pool to save Amanda. I held her above water until help came. I nearly drowned doing it. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital afterward. The pneumonia destroyed my nervous system. I've been sick my entire adult life because of that moment. I paused, letting the words settle into the silence. I never asked for gratitude. I never expected anything in return. I just did what any sister would do. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. And you spent 20 years resenting me for it. Not because I asked for too much, but because my existence reminded you of everything you're not. And when you needed to protect your secret, you turned my own sister into a weapon against me. I turned to Amanda. Her face was blotchy with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She looked broken in a way I had never seen before. You wanted to believe I was a liar, I said softly. It was easier than seeing the truth about our mother. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for what you did to me, but I understand now. You were a pawn. She used your jealousy like a tool. Amanda didn't speak. She just stood there, tears falling silently, staring at me with something that might have been shame or grief or both. I walked toward the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame and turned back one final time. I spent my whole life hoping this family would finally see my worth. I don't need that anymore. I don't need any of you. I walked out without looking back. Officers escorted Amanda, my mother, and Uncle Mark to separate police cars. I watched from the sidewalk as they were led away. Amanda walked like a ghost, hollow and empty, her defiance completely gone. My mother was read her rights regarding conspiracy to commit assault and federal wire fraud. She would be held pending coordination with the FBI. Mark was handcuffed and placed in a separate vehicle for embezzlement charges. I stood alone on the sidewalk as the cars pulled away. The autumn air was cool against my face. I felt exhausted, empty, and strangely peaceful all at once. A gentle hand touched my arm. I turned to find Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, from down the hall standing beside me. She must have seen the police cars from her window and come to find me. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly. I managed a small smile. "I will be." She took my hand in both of hers, her grip warm and steady. "Your grandfather called me, you know, a few weeks before he passed. He said keep an eye on Christina for me. She's the only good one in the whole bunch." She squeezed my hand gently. I promised him I would. I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time all day, but there was still one envelope remaining, the one Harold had written for me alone, and inside were the words I had waited 35 years to hear. That evening I sat alone in my apartment with the final envelope in my hands, the one marked with my name in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. I had been carrying it with me since leaving Jonathan Webb's office, but I hadn't been ready to open it. Now, with the autumn sun setting outside my window and the chaos of the day finally behind me, I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Christina," it began. "If you're reading this, I am no longer there to protect you. But I need you to know that I spent my final years trying to make things right. Not through revenge, but through truth. I know what you did for Amanda when you were 14. I know that's why you got sick. I was there when they brought you out of that pool, barely breathing. I watched you fight for your life in that hospital, and I watched your mother dismiss your sacrifice like it meant nothing. I never said anything because I thought foolishly that time would soften her, that she would eventually see what I saw, a daughter of extraordinary courage and integrity. I was wrong. Some people cannot see goodness in others because it reflects too harshly on themselves. I chose you for the foundation not simply because you're qualified, though you are the most qualified person I know. I chose you because you are the only one in this family who never wanted anything from me except my love. You never asked for money. You never asked for favoritism. You just wanted to be seen. I see you, Christina. I have always seen you. You don't need your mother's approval. You don't need Amanda's apology. You don't need anyone's permission to know your own worth. But I wanted to say it clearly one final time. You are enough. You have always been enough. You were always the best of us. Live well, sweetheart. Build something beautiful with the foundation. Help others who, like you, were failed by the people who should have protected them. That will be my legacy and yours. All my love, always and forever, Grandpa Harold. I read the letter 3 times. Then I cried. really cried. For the first time since his death, I let myself feel everything I had been holding back. These were not tears of grief. They were tears of release. 35 years of waiting to be seen, 35 years of hoping someone in my family would acknowledge my worth. And here it was in my grandfather's own handwriting. He had seen me all along. He had always known. 6 weeks later, the legal proceedings concluded. I did not attend any of the hearings. I had said everything I needed to say. My attorney, Rebecca Torres, kept me informed of the outcomes, and I received each update with quiet acceptance. Amanda pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment causing serious bodily injury. She was sentenced to 18 months in state prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The judge ordered her to pay full restitution for my medical expenses. During her sentencing, she did not look at our mother. She submitted a written statement to the court accepting full responsibility for her actions, though she noted she had been manipulated by someone she trusted. The judge acknowledged this, but ruled that adult choices carry adult consequences. I heard later that Amanda walked into that prison without protest, without drama. Something in her had broken that day in the lawyer's office. Whether she would ever rebuild herself into something better, I couldn't say. That was her journey now, not mine. My mother was convicted of conspiracy to commit assault and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The FBI case moved quickly due to the clear documentation my grandfather's investigator had compiled. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The judge ordered her to pay restitution of $190,000, her share of the embezzled funds. During her trial, she attempted to blame Uncle Mark entirely. The financial records proved otherwise. The judge called her actions a betrayal of the most fundamental bonds of family. I was told she showed no emotion when the sentence was read. Even at the end, she refused to accept responsibility. Uncle Mark pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and embezzlement. He received 5 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay back his share of the stolen money. His wife filed for divorce before his sentencing. The man who had smiled nervously at family gatherings for years, who had sweated through my grandfather's funeral, knowing his secrets were about to surface, would spend the next 5 years paying for his choices. I sent a single message through my attorney, which was read aloud at my mother's sentencing. I did not seek revenge. I sought truth. The justice system has delivered its verdict. I have nothing more to say to any of them. I wish them clarity, and I hope someday they find the courage to be honest with themselves. 6 months after the will reading, everything had changed. I stood at a podium in a beautiful event space in downtown Boston, looking out at a room filled with donors, advocates, medical professionals, and the first beneficiaries of our new program. The Harold Hartwell Foundation had launched its flagship initiative, the Second Chance Program. We provided financial assistance, medical support, and legal advocacy for people with chronic illnesses who had been failed or abandoned by their families. People like me. I spoke to that room with a clarity I had never felt before. My grandfather taught me that family is not defined by blood. It is defined by how people treat you. I spent 35 years hoping my family would finally see my value. I know now that I was looking for love in a place where it was never going to grow. I paused looking at the faces before me, but I also learned that family can be built with intention, with kindness, with people who choose to show up for you. That is what this foundation will support. People who are building their own families on their own terms. The program received national media attention. Within 6 months, we had helped over 200 individuals navigate medical crises, escape toxic family situations, and rebuild their lives with dignity. Every success story felt like a small victory, not just for them, but for the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me. Mrs. Patterson became my surrogate grandmother. Sunday dinners at her apartment became a sacred tradition. She made pot roast and told me stories about her late husband, and I helped her with her crossword puzzles. She never asked for anything in return except my company. That was what real family felt like. Dr. Sullivan told me during a routine checkup that my condition had stabilized significantly. Stress is poison for autoimmune conditions, she said with a warm smile. Peace is medicine. You finally found some peace. She was right. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't fighting just to survive. I was living. A distant cousin named Laura reached out to me after seeing the news coverage of the foundation launch. She had always quietly disagreed with how I was treated at family gatherings, she said, but she had never known how to speak up. We began meeting for coffee, then dinner, then long walks through the city. A genuine friendship grew between us. I started to understand what chosen family really meant. 6 months after the will reading, on a golden autumn afternoon, I sat by my apartment window, watching the trees blaze with color. I held my grandfather's photograph in my hands, smiling softly at his familiar face. For 35 years, I believed that love had to be earned, that if I was patient enough, selfless enough, invisible enough, my family would finally see me. I saved my sister's life when I was 14 years old, and I paid for that choice every day since. Not because saving her was wrong, but because I expected gratitude from people who were incapable of giving it. Grandpa Harold was the only one who saw me clearly, and in the end, he gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me: permission to stop waiting. I don't hate my mother. I don't hate Amanda. Hate requires energy, and I've spent enough of my life giving them energy they never deserved. I simply let them go. I placed the photograph on the windowsill next to a small plant that was finally blooming after months of careful tending. And that was the moment I finally understood the greatest freedom of all is no longer needing anyone's permission to know your own worth. Christina's story carries lessons that many of us need to hear. The first truth is this: your worth is not determined by those who refuse to see it. Some people will never acknowledge your value not because you lack it, but because recognizing your goodness would force them to confront their own failures. That is their burden to carry, not yours. The second lesson is about the difference between forgiveness and freedom. Christina did not forgive her mother or her sister. She did not pretend the pain never happened. Instead, she chose to stop giving them power over her life. She let them go. You can release someone from your heart without excusing what they did. You can walk away without hatred simply because hatred requires energy that belongs to your future, not your past. The third truth is perhaps the most important: family is not always blood. Family is built through intention, through kindness, through people who show up for you when it matters. If the family you were born into cannot love you properly, you have every right to build a new one. Finally, remember that justice does not require revenge. Christina did not destroy her family out of anger. She simply told the truth and let the consequences unfold naturally. Truth spoken clearly and without apology is its own form of justice. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Your support helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. I would love to know your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from family members who could not see your worth? Have you built a chosen family of your own? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are enough exactly as you are.